to be names that ought never to be spoken aloud upon the sea. Not for that they are accursed, but for that they bear too great a weight. Mary Rose was one such name, spoken with dread, not cried out, never cried out. Ever in low voices, hands closing tight about their cans, eyes straying toward the mouth of the harbour. Even amongst pirates that name carried weight. She was not yet a legend. She was real, and she sailed. The Mary Rose was one of the greatest ships of the English Navy, proud, broad of beam, and heavy with iron, built not for merchants, not for explorers, but for the King of England himself. For more than 3 decades of uneasy wars, she sailed as one of the first true warships of her kind, a vessel fashioned not merely to cross the sea, but to master it. She moved upon the water like a floating fortress, her gun ports gaping like the mouths of beasts, teeth of iron lurking behind lips of timber. Her banners stood stiff in the wind, not dancing, but commanding, bearing the calm and certain authority of the crown, wherever her shadow fell. In those days, when I was yet reckless and believed the sea favoured bold hearts, we learned early to keep clear of her shadow. More than once, beneath low clouds and scant light, I felt my blood turn cold when her hull passed somewhere beyond the fog. We didn't challenge ships like that. We survived them. When I was young, rash, swift, with more courage than judgment, that name already wrought an instant hush upon any pirate deck, not from hatred, from respect. For the Mary Rose was not merely a ship of the crown, she was presence, she was shadow, she was the sort of vessel that made a captain alter his course ere ever a sail was spied upon the horizon. I remember it well. I had yet no white in my beard, nor bones that creaked with the cold. I was a new pirate then, hungry, learning to read the sea as one learns the temper of a great beast. And more than once we were forced to sheer away, to shorten sail, to douse the lanterns, to wait long hours in utter silence because someone had murmured, "Mary Rose." That name froze the blood. It was said her cannon spat death with unerring aim, that her crew were too well disciplined to make mistakes, that to face such a ship was the same as to vanish from the charts, and mayhap it was for that very reason that her end was so cruel. Years later, long after the battle songs had fallen silent, I met the man who had seen her die. They called him the old Flemish sailor. I found him in a low tavern hard by the London docks, where the smell of salt mingled with that of cheap wine, when I already bore too many scars to pretend the world yet owed me aught. The sort of place where seamen drink not to celebrate, but to forget what still dogs them. He was already old when first I met him, older still in his gaze. His hand shook as though the deck beneath him never ceased its motion. He did not give his name. There was no need. There are men who speak loud to be marked, and there are men like him who speak little, for every word costs them something. He was old when I met him, but when the Mary Rose went down, he was yet young. When he learned that I had sailed those waters, that I had seen the Mary Rose under way, he looked upon me for a long while ere he spoke. He did not begin by speaking of the ship. He began by speaking of the night. He said the sky was dark, yet it was no blind night. There was moon enough to make out shapes, Ships, the distant glimmer of guns, enough to see silhouettes, not enough to spy the danger. The Battle of the Solent was then underway. English and French moved like ill-set pieces upon a board. The French fleet had come on bold and numerous, and the English answered in kind. Far off the sound of cannon, the French fleet ranging, the English fleet stirring. It was war, aye, but not the sort that ends in glory. It was confused, disordered, full of waiting. The Mary Rose had fired her starboard guns again and again. The iron recoil shook my very bones, so he said, and the lower gun ports were left standing open. A small error, a mortal one. The smoke yet hung upon the water, and the stink of powder still clung to the air, but no man was thinking of the sea. According to the old Flemish sailor, no man perceived it at the first. The ship began to manoeuvre, slow, confident. Then came the wind, not a gale, no warning from the heavens, only a stronger gust, only a sudden and cruel breath, the kind of wind that sailors curse only when it is already too late. When the Mary Rose began to swing, there was no alarm, no running to and fro. The wind pressed gently upon the sails, and the hull answered, too slow. Then came the list, small, scarce to be marked. The ship was turning, her lower deck gun ports, left open after the firing, drew nearer, and then the sea found its breach. It entered through the open ports as though it already knew the way. The old Flemish sailor said the water did not rush. It came in, silently, decisively. When the men understood what was come upon them, the deck was already canting beneath their feet. The Mary Rose heeled, and the water came in. He told me he felt the cold first at his feet, then at his knees. Cold, swift. One man cried out orders, another cried the name of God. The guns, rolling like blind giants, crushing men who had no time to cry out. 500 souls were aboard that night. He told me so while staring into his cup. Never once at me. He said he heard pounding upon the timbers. Not pleas for help. Desperate blows as though the hull might answer. But thick wood answers no supplication. He said some men yet tried to swim, burdened by weapons, by heavy clothes, by duties that sink swifter than bodies. All was done in minutes, mayhap less. The list increased, and the ship, proud for decades, lost her balance like a wounded man. The darkness within the hull came at once, and the cries lasted too short a while to be clearly remembered. There was no space. There was no air. Men slipped, struck against one another, clawed for hatches already drowned. The old Flemish sailor broke off more than once. He drank. He drew deep breaths. The Mary Rose was not overcome by the enemy, he said. She did not fight. There was no explosion, no battle, only the groaning of wood. She simply turned and laid herself down upon the waters of the Solent, and was gone. In minutes, all was ended, and then silence. The kind of silence that comes not after battle, but after a mistake. There was no time for ordered rescue, no heroism, only water closing in. She sank before all eyes. The king himself stood watching, astonished, unbelieving. The Mary Rose was his favoured ship. Ships close by, boats standing ready, souls enough to save many. But the sea does not care to share what it has chosen. The water smoothed itself once more, and the sea went on as though naught had come to pass. When the ship vanished, the battle raged on about her. But there, The night shut fast like a tomb. Of near 500 men aboard, only a few score came up alive. The old Flemish sailor escaped by instinct alone, climbing, clutching, drawing breath where others could not. The rest never touched the surface. When he was hauled from the water by hands he scarcely saw, he said the Mary Rose had already gone. Not sunk. Gone. He fell silent for a time. He drank. He drew a long breath. Then he said a thing I have never forgotten. She did not sink because of the enemy. She sank because all were looking the wrong way. Long after he had done speaking, I remained silent, for I remembered her. I remembered being young, cutting through the fog, my heart hammering as her silhouette passed close enough that I could hear the orders carried across the water. She frightened us in those days. But this frightened me far more, not because she died in battle, but because she died by a moment's carelessness. The night passed. The war turned its page. Names were lost, as kingdoms fell, as charts were redrawn, as men such as I grew old. For centuries the Mary Rose lay below, not as a ship, but as a place. Fish made their home of her, currents ran through her passages, time did what it ever does, yet it did not touch all things. And the sea, curiously, chose to preserve. When the hull was found again, it did not seem a common wreck. It seemed a moment kept. Shoes where they had been left. Tools awaiting hands that never returned. Objects made for the morrow, the future, arrested. And then they resolved to bring her back. Many years later, when my hair had gone grey and the sea had at last loosened its grip upon my legs, I went to see her again. Not at sea, on firm ground. Today the Mary Rose lies in a museum at Portsmouth, England, near the very waters that swallowed her, in measured silence, under studied light, with placards and explanations. Yet no placard tells what a man told me that night. None speaks of the weight of a ship that did not fall in combat, was not overcome, but merely erred at the wrong hour. It was a cold, damp afternoon. Rain clung to stone and glass, and there were few visitors, only echoes, footsteps, and the distant sound of water against the harbour walls. I do not care for firm ground, never have, but I went. Within they showed what they could save. Timbers darkened by centuries, bones, tools, shoes that would never walk again. And there she was, or what time had permitted them to reclaim. Incomplete, never whole, only one side of her body as though the sea had taken a bite and refused ever to let it go, as though the night itself had simply shut a door and would not open it again. I stood long and looked. I saw the small objects and felt a thing I had not expected. Not fear, weariness. The weariness of one who understands too late that even the most feared of ships may fall without warning. There, before the Mary Rose, I remembered her passing me in the darkness, my course bending away from that name upon the open sea. The fear she once inspired, the power she bore, unaware that the greatest danger was not to face her, but to believe her invincible. And I thought of the old Flemish sailor, alone with his memories, living on when hundreds did not, of the tavern, of the silence that lay between one sentence and the next. I stood there longer than I had meant to. People walk about her open hull, peering within as one looks upon an ancient body, and few mark a simple thing. She does not seem a ship at rest. She seems a ship interrupted, as though caught in the midst of a sentence that was never finished. Some visitors say they feel unease, others a sorrow hard to name. There are those who leave sooner than they came. It is not fear, not wholly. It is the sense of standing before something that did not end when it should have. Now they call it history. They set her behind glass. They give her labels and careful light. But I know better. Some ships do not rest. I have seen many ships go down. Some were taken screaming by the fury of storms, masts torn like broken bones, men praying to gods they had long since forgotten. Others burned beneath the thunder of war, swallowed by noise, by smoke, and by the false comfort of glory. But few taught me so much as the Mary Rose. She taught me that not every end gives warning, that not every horror rises from darkness or from chaos. Some endings come quietly, borne upon a careless wind, through a door left open and unguarded. And she taught me this above all, that the sea need not rage to be cruel. At times, it prefers to take those who challenge it with confidence, with pride, with the calm conviction that they have mastered it. So I say this to thee, if ever thou goest to Portsmouth, if ever thou enterest that museum, and findest thyself standing beside that ancient hull, do not merely look, stand still, listen. Strive to hear the last breaths yet caught within the timber, the final prayers, the confusion, the hands seeking something solid where nothing remained. And remember, she died in war, but not because of it. She died swiftly. She died filled with men who believed there would yet be a morrow. There are voyages that were never finished, and there are ships that still wait for someone to come aboard again to complete what was broken off. The Mary Rose is one of these, and the sea never forgets when a giant stumbles in his own shadow. Aye, she was a fine, gilded bird of the line, the Mary Rose. I saw her once, before the silt took her, sitting proud on the Solent like a swan in a gutter. King Harry's darling. But the sea has no respect for kings, nor the heavy iron they cram into a hull. They'll tell you she heeled in a gust. They'll tell you her ports were too low and the water invited itself in. But they do not speak of the netting, a great, thick web of anti-boarding rope, stretched tight across the decks to keep the Frenchies out. When she tipped, that web didn't keep the enemy out. It kept the poor souls in. I've drifted o'er that spot when the moon is thin as a cutlass blade. The divers, those iron-headed men who go down into the dark, they talk of the green gloom. They say when the tide turns you can feel a tugging at your flippers. Not the current, mind. It's the fingers of 500 archers and mariners, still reaching through that phantom netting, trying to find a hole that isn't there. There was a dog, too. A ratter. I've seen him, salt-white and translucent, running across the black waves of the Solent when the fog is thick enough to carve. He's looking for his master, the carpenter. But the carpenter is bone, and the bone is in a box, and the box is on dry land where no sailor ever truly rests. I heard it first from a diver, a man with more salt in his beard than sense in his head. He'd been down to the Mary Rose more times than he could count, pulling up the bones of King Harry's pride from the silt where she'd been sleeping since 1545. But it wasn't the cannons or the gold he remembered. No, lad, it was the dog. They found him in the carpenter's cabin, curled tight like he was napping. A small thing, no bigger than a ship's cat, with bones brittle as old parchment. The scholars, they gave him a name, Hatch, after the door he died behind. He was the ship's ratter, you see. His job was to hunt the vermin what gnawed at the stores and spread disease through the lower decks. A humble task, but an honest one. And the sea, she respects honesty. Now the diver, his name was Collier, or Column, or some such, he told me that when they brought the skeleton up, wrapped in silt and kelp, the bones were still locked in a death grip. His jaws were clamped tight around something small. At first, they thought it was a bit of rope. But no, lad, it was a rat, or what was left of one. The little devil had died with his teeth in his enemy's neck, fighting to the bitter, drowning end. The scholars put him in a glass case in Portsmouth, alongside the ship's ribs and rusted blades. A monument to loyalty, they said. But monuments don't scratch at the walls in the dead of night. It started with the night guards, men who'd done 100 shifts in that gallery, walking the same floors, hearing the same silence. But one by one, they began to notice it. A soft sound, like claws on wood. Always coming from the far corner near the reconstructed carpenter's cabin. Some said it was the old timber settling. Others claimed it was rats, real rats, the kind what still haunt old buildings. But then came the thump. Not loud, mind ye. Not the crash of a boot or the slam of a door. No, this was softer, rhythmic. Like a tail wagging against a plank, like a dog waiting for his master to come home. One guard, a stout fellow named Graves who'd served in the Navy and feared nothing on God's green earth. He swore he saw it. He was locking up one February night, the kind of night where the fog rolls in thick as wool and the world goes quiet. He turned off the last light, and in the glow of his torch, he saw something move. A shadow. Small, low to the ground, it darted between the display cases quick as a flash and disappeared into the ribs of the Mary Rose herself. Graves stood there, frozen, his breath caught in his throat. And then he heard it, a soft whine. The kind a dog makes when it's confused, when it's lost. He didn't go back to that gallery after dark, not ever again. Now, here's the part what chills me, lad. The part I can't shake, no matter how much rum I pour down my gullet. The Mary Rose, she sank with over 500 men aboard, 500 souls trapped beneath the anti-boarding nets, drowning slow in the dark. They're still down there, you see. Most of them, pinned beneath the silt, their bones tangled in the timbers like roots in the earth. The sea took 'em and the sea keeps 'em, but not Hatch. You see, a dog has no sin. He doesn't covet or betray. He doesn't curse God or abandon his post. He simply is. And because of that, the sea couldn't hold him. His spirit slipped free like water through a net, and it's been wandering ever since. But here's the rub, lad. The thing what keeps me awake when the wind howls and the timbers creak. Hatch is still looking, still searching. He runs through the galleries, through the reconstructed decks, through the very bones of the ship what killed him. He's waiting for his master to come home. But his master is still down there, still 5 centuries deep, his hand reaching for a door that'll never open. Some nights, when the museum is dark and the city sleeps, they say you can hear it. The scratching, the thump of a phantom tail, and if you listen close, real close, you might hear something else. A soft, distant drumming, like fists against wood, like men trapped in the dark, still trying to break free. But the dog just keeps waiting, and he'll wait forever, lad. Because loyalty don't drown. It was told to me by a woman. Old as the stones she was, with eyes like sea glass and a voice like wind through a broken hull. She claimed her grandmother told it to her, and her grandmother heard it from her grandmother, all the way back to the summer of 1545. A chain of whispers, stretching back through the centuries. The Mary Rose went down on a July morning just off the Spithead, within sight of the South Sea shore. The king himself was watching from the castle, watching his great warship heel over and swallow the sea like a dying whale. 500 men aboard, archers, gunners, sailors, boys no older than yourself. And when she rolled, when the water rushed in through her open gun ports, there was no time to scream, no time to pray. But here's the devil's own trick, lad. The water was shallow, so shallow that when she settled on the bottom, her masts were still sticking up through the surface, like the fingers of a drowning giant, clawing at the sky. And the air stayed trapped. You see, when a ship sinks fast and deep, the pressure crushes everything. The cabins flood, the lungs give out, and the end comes quick. But the Mary Rose, she went down gentle. She laid herself on the seabed like a tired woman taken to her bed. And the upper decks, the gun rooms, the cabins, the spaces beneath the forecastle, they held pockets of air, enough to breathe, enough to hope. But hope is a cruel thing when the sea has ye in her grip. The men inside, they were trapped, pinned beneath the anti-boarding nets, what were meant to keep the Frenchies out. Those nets, thick as a spider's web, became their shrouds. They pressed their faces against the hemp, clawing at the knots, feeling the cold water rise inch by inch. Some drowned quick, gasping and choking. But others they found the air pockets. They crawled into the darkness, into the cabins where the water hadn't yet reached, and they waited. They waited for rescue that would never come. The old woman, she told me that the folk of South Sea couldn't sleep after that day. They'd lie in their beds, listening to the wind, and when the tide was low and the night was still, they'd hear it. At first, they thought it was the waves, the hull knocking against the rocks, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful. It was coming from inside the wreck. The men were still alive, lad, trapped in the dark with the air growing foul and the tide creeping higher. They banged on the hull with their fists, with their boots, with anything they could find. They screamed until their voices gave out, until their lungs burned, until the hope bled out of them like water from a cracked barrel. The townsfolk, they tried to ignore it. They stuffed wool in their ears, they sang hymns, they prayed to St. Nicholas to take the souls and grant them peace. But the drumming didn't stop. Not for days. Not for weeks. And then, one night, it got faster. frantic, desperate, like a heartbeat in its last. And then, silence. The air had run out, you see. The water had risen to the ceilings. The men had finally stopped fighting. The sea had won. But the old woman, she told me something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight as a mast. She said that even now, even after they raised the Mary Rose from the deep, even after they hauled her bones to the surface and put them in a museum for the curious to gawk at, even now, on quiet foggy nights, when the wind dies down and the world holds its breath, you can still hear it. Not from the wreck, no. The wreck is long gone, preserved in glass and steel, but from the shore, from the sands of South Sea where the waves lap gentle and the fog rolls in thick. They say the drumming comes from beneath the sand, from the ghosts of the men who crawled through the dark, clawing at the wood, praying for someone to hear 'em. They're still there, lad, still trapped, still waiting, and on the darkest nights when the moon hides her face and the sea is black as pitch, some folks swear they hear something else. Not drumming, but voices, muffled, distant, like men calling out from beneath the earth, calling for help that'll never come. Now, I don't know if it's true, lad. I've never walked the sands of South Sea myself, but I know this. When a man drowns slow, when he fights the sea with every breath and loses, the sea remembers. She keeps a part of him, and sometimes she lets him speak. So if you ever find yourself on that shore and the fog rolls in and the world goes quiet, listen close. You might hear it. And if you do, lad, don't answer, because the sea, she's always looking for company. And she's got room for one more. Now, still want to hear another, or have you had your fill of drowning men for one night? When they hauled the Mary Rose back into the light, they thought they were saving history. They sprayed her with wax day and night to keep her from turning to dust. But they didn't realize they were unsealing a tomb that had been under a holy guard. You see, shipmate, the old shipwrights, they knew the sea was full of demons. They carved witch marks, strange, twisting symbols, into the very heart oak of the ship. Apotropaic marks, they call them. They were meant to keep the evil out. But when the ship sank and the men died in terror, those marks changed their purpose. They worked too well. They didn't keep the evil out. They sealed the souls in. They turned that hull into a spiritual jail. There was an archer among them, a titan of a man, his spine twisted and gnarled like an old root from a lifetime of pulling the heavy yew-bow. The divers in the 70s working in that blind green soup of the Solent. They felt him. I heard it whispered through the currents, how a man was a-reaching into the silt when a hand, cold as an iceberg but feeling like flesh, clamped round his ankle. He turned his torch, hoping to see a skull, something he could understand. But instead, he saw a face, a real face, skin grey like a shark's belly, eyes wide and bright with a Tudor madness. It was the archer, the watcher, a-looking through the silt as if he were still guarding the deck. Then, with a flick of a fin, the silt swirled and there was naught but a bone sticking out of the mud. And now she sits in Portsmouth, But have you ever stood near her ribs and breathed deeply? The scholars, they prattle on about their alchemists' washes and their waxes. I tell ye, it is the smell of the centuries. It's the breath of 500 men, held in for 400 years, finally being exhaled into the lungs of the living. It's a heavy anaerobic scent, the smell of stagnant water, old fear, and a deck that hasn't felt the sun since the days of the Great Harry. When you walk those galleries and you feel a sudden chill, or you see a shadow moving in the corner of your eye that looks like a man pulling a bow, don't run. It's just the Watcher. He's been waiting a long time for a fresh soul to join the crew, and thanks to those witch marks, he ain't never leaving. The tide is turning and the cursed Corsair weighs anchor. Keep your feet to the cobblestones and your eyes afoul of the fog, shipmate. For the sea has a long memory, and she's always looking for a new cage to fill. Until the glass runs dry, fare thee well.